So welcome everybody here today. Let me get right into some of your questions. Actually, let me start with an obvious place right now, and that is that many of your questions are ones that ask me to predict the future. And I can't do that. I'm a historian. I'm a prophet, as they say, of the past. And I can tell you what patterns to look for going forward. But I have no idea whether they're going to move the venues from of the indictments to federal court, for example, from Florida and from Georgia. I just have no idea. People have asked also about the pardon power, and Joanne's and my recent podcast that drops tomorrow is all about the history of the pardon power, starting with, I don't know, some dude from some king of Wessex, I think, in like 300 of the Common Era or something. I don't know. That's Joanne's stuff. But I'm not going to talk about that today because then there's no point in having done the podcast. So I'm not going to talk about that either. Oh, Upper and Peninsula. That's so pretty up there. All right, so let me start with simple questions first so we can get through into the bigger picture stuff. First of all, people have asked at great length about whether or not Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis will be thrown out either by impeachment from the Georgia legislature or under the new Georgia law about the removal of district attorneys. And my answer, at least to the first, is no, and to the second is I don't know. But in terms of impeachment, in order for her to be impeached and thrown out of office, as some Republicans in Georgia have asked or have called for, you would have to have 2/3 of the lower chamber to vote in favor of that. And since the Republicans do not have a supermajority, that would also include 4 Democrats to vote that direction. So that's not going to happen. But even before we get there, remember that an awful lot of lawmakers don't want, Republican lawmakers don't want Donald Trump to be in office anymore either, or don't want him to be around anymore either, because he is deadly to the lower ballot races. And so while they don't dare to come out and oppose him, they have quietly been hoping that something would take him out of the picture for a long time. So they're not going to turn around now and say, yeah, we're going to fight for him. They're very, very happy to have somebody else stand, run interference and get him out of the way. The thing that people have asked a lot about is the new Georgia law about district attorneys, and everybody thinks that that was put in place to get rid of Fani Willis. And you have to remember that there was another big case in which there was a very badly behaved district attorney, and that was the Arbery case, the young man who was running in jogging in Georgia. I'm afraid I'm always confused about the years. Maybe it was last year. Let me look here. No, it's a while ago now. The district attorney in that case, if you remember, actually actively worked to shield that young man's killers. And the new law that was put in place was in part to push back against district attorneys like that. So, I'm not suggesting that it couldn't be used against Willis, but that people who are arguing that it was put in place specifically to go after her need to look back a little bit further, because it was a district attorney in the Brunswick area named Jackie Johnson who has been charged for her own participation in the cover-up of that killing. So I don't know what's going to happen in that case with regard to Willis, but it's a mistake to think that that law was targeted at her. It was much more likely targeted at DAs like Johnson, who ended up being charged herself for covering up the Arbery case. I wrote at great length about that. If anybody's interested, you can search either Facebook or the Substack search bar, which you don't have to subscribe to that. You can just go to it. It's heathercoxrichardson.substack.com. If you're interested. I actually I believe I stayed up all night writing about the Arbery case because I watched the video, which is just horrific, and sort of dug into that case, which is probably the reason that I took a look at that law and went, oh, they're reacting to her and not to Fani Willis. Just again, a little bit of an aside here. I know absolutely nothing about where Willis comes from. I know nothing about her family or anything else, but I kind of like to point out that Willis is one of the oldest names in Virginia. And the Willis family intermarried with James Madison's family for 3 generations. And I always kind of like to think of her as being related to that family. I don't know if that's the case, but wouldn't that be poetic justice? All right. Anyway, a couple other questions. People asked in the legal cases about Donald Trump, which things should you pay attention to right now because it's already becoming overwhelming. And I totally get that. And what I would say is maybe nothing yet. That is, what's happening right now is a lot of jockeying amongst the lawyers, and for what it's worth, I do follow it very closely, and I will write about it when it seems to me to be worth paying attention to. And that's not to say that I might not do a roundup later on, but while the jockeying is of great interest right now to people like me, for instance, or to lawyers, um, you know, unless you really care about the details of the moving pieces, it's probably not worth paying attention except for the really big moments. So today, for example, one of the people who was an organizer and a participant um, in the Georgia fake electors case uh, gave a document to the courts in which he provided a transcript of the meeting at which the lawyer for Trump convinced them or justified the Georgia fake electors for going ahead and voting in favor of Trump. And that's important because that same man had lied to the court before and said that such a transcript didn't exist. Now, if you're really into it, that's cool and it matters. And I read the transcript and I thought it was a very powerful document for somebody who studies documents the way I do. Do most people care about that? I would say not. And I always think about it in terms of if I were writing a book about this in 150 years, that's always the way I look at the news. And if I were writing a book about this in 150 years, man, I would skim over an awful lot of this early legal jockeying, because what's going to happen is there's going to be tons and tons and tons of not posturing, shifting to get into good positions for the eventual trials. The trials themselves are going to take up enormous amounts of oxygen, and they're going to be really interesting. And that's the place really to put your real attention, unless something huge happens. Like, for example, people are asking right now, is Trump gonna leave the country? First of all, I have no idea. But second of all, what does that look like? I mean, how do you just casually go to another country, even with a private plane, especially when you're surrounded by Secret Service agents? I mean, I'm not good at breaking the law, so I have no idea how one would do that. If something like that happens, then yeah, pay attention. But until then, I'm not paying a lot of attention yet. Okay, so a couple more quick questions, and then I'll get into some of the larger themes here. A lot of you are asking about the recent documents concerning the 14th Amendment and the third section of the 14th Amendment that disqualifies from holding office a large set of people who have previously broken oaths of office or participated in insurrections, and whether or not that includes people like Donald Trump and other members of the Republican Party who were part of his attempt to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And the answer to all of that, first of all, there's a number of different angles that people have asked about. And the first is who brings suit in that case? Well, so the argument that at this point, legal scholars have made very publicly in the last week, and plenty of people were doing it before that, is that that this just is. It doesn't have to be litigated in court the same way that if an 18-year-old decides to run for president, when that person tried to file paperwork, the people filing the paperwork will say, no, you can't do that because you're not the age you need to become president. What they were trying to argue is that this is self-executing, that there's no lawsuit, there's no anything, it just is. But of course, even in their documents, even in the articles they wrote, and I'll explain who those people are in a minute, they said obviously this would be litigated. That if you said to somebody you can't participate in government because you were an insurrectionist, they're going to sue, and they're going to take it, certainly in the case of Trump, all the way to the Supreme Court. And that's why I think that the two articles in the last week, one by, again, a couple of men named Bowd and Paulson, and the other by Judge Michael Luttig and Lawrence Tribe, were really interesting because they were saying that the Supreme Court would have to decide about this. And of course, one of the reasons that people who are interested in overturning the attempts of the, hold on, buddy, who are interested in overturning the things that Trump and the MAGA Republicans have done, and they're reluctant to go to the Supreme Court because, of course, the Supreme Court has been stacked with extremists, with MAGA Republicans, and it also has on it Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Clarence Thomas, who at this point both have real reasons to be suspect in terms of the ways that they're handing down decisions. So one of the things to think about when you think about the articles by Luttig and the other two men, not Lawrence Tribe, although he was an author of them, is that Tribe is a constitutional lawyer and a very well-regarded constitutional lawyer from Harvard, but he has always been perceived as a liberal. And by liberal, I've talked about this, what this means about before. This is not a political designation, a party designation, so much as it is an understanding that the government has a role to play in regulating business, providing a basic social safety net, promoting civil rights, and promoting infrastructure. And that's something that members of any political party belonged to until very recently. So that's Lawrence Tribe. But what's interesting about the other three people, and the reason that, for example, Judge Luttig is out there, by the way, it's spelled Luttig, pronounced Luttig. The reason that it's important that they're all out there is that they are all conservative lawyers associated, especially in the case of the two men who wrote for the Pennsylvania Law Review, Paulson and Bowd, or I didn't hear pronounce his name. They are all associated with the Federalist Society. Now, why is that important? It's important because the Federalist Society began in the 1980s as a legal organization designed to push back against what they at the time called judicial activism. And that was the idea that the Supreme Court was overstepping its bounds by using the 14th Amendment to promote civil rights, essentially, but to promote the regulation of business and the other things that the modern government was doing. Well, so for these three, but especially, and Luttig has the popular reputation, these other two lawyers have this, I think it's 126, I read it, 126 page article. That's a really big deal because it's not that they're saying anything that's that new, it's that they are who they are saying it. And that article that the two Federalist Society lawyers wrote in the Pennsylvania law, I think it's Pennsylvania Law Review, I don't remember what the exact title of it is that they not only came out and said the 14th Amendment is a no-brainer, I paraphrase, although it was a pretty lightly written article, it was easy to read. But they also said in it that it was pretty obvious that the 14th Amendment's call for protection of equality, the federal government must protect equality in the states because of the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clauses of the 14th Amendment. It only made sense that that would be expanded to protect women's rights, gender rights. And that coming from Federalist Society lawyers, I just about dropped my teeth as I was reading it, because that was exactly what the Federalist Society was put in place to get rid of. And here they're like, oh yeah, it's a no-brainer. The other thing that was, or not no-brainer, they said it was a logical thing to do to make that expansion, and they were making a comparative expansion, saying that the 14th Amendment's third section, which disqualifies certain people from holding office, obviously should be expanded to include, or should be understood to include, the people who participated in the events of trying to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. The other thing in that article that I thought was really interesting, which a lot of people won't care that much about, but is they mentioned Alexander Hamilton, approvingly. And that was a really interesting piece, because Alexander Hamilton, of course, called for a strong federal government. And Hamilton has been somebody whose reputation has been in real disrepute as increasingly Republican politicians have called for cutting apart the federal government. So to have these two men talking approvingly of Alexander Hamilton was again very surprising for me. And anyway, all that to say, the reason that those arguments ultimately matter is less that they're saying anything new, I'll tell you more about that in a minute, than who they are that's saying them. Because what I think they're trying to do is give a ramp for the Supreme Court to say, yeah, you're right, this really does count, in a way they might not have if it had only been Lawrence Tribe who was saying that. So that's what's going on with that particular argument. I will add here that historians, to a person, will tell you there's simply no doubt that the 14th Amendment was designed for exactly this sort of an event. It's just not really negotiable. If you understand the 14th Amendment and the arguments that went into the 14th Amendment and the period in which the 14th Amendment was written, it's just a no-brainer. But that's not the actual history of that moment. The real history of that moment is not something that's hugely widely known, and it's a little hard for me to articulate why that's the case, because of course that's my bread and butter, and so to me it's like there's nothing more interesting in the world. And yet even in the law review article in which the men laid out what they considered the history, it just wasn't overwhelmingly accurate. Not because they're dumb, that's not what they do, they're constitutional lawyers, but again, if you know the history, it's very, very difficult to think of a way you could come up with the opposite argument. So all right. Yeah. Hi, Emma. How are you? I hope it's a beautiful day there. We finally have sun here, and I think of you when we finally have these beautiful days after so many days of fog. All right, so now, oh, I'm sorry, there's one more question that's easy to get rid of. Oh, two more that are easy to get rid of, maybe even three. And that is, you ask me every week about why Tommy Tuberville, whom you finally convinced me to pronounce the correct way, can hold up so many military promotions. It is not the filibuster. Although that probably could have caused its own sorts of trouble. It is that, remember I keep saying to you that the Senate has really arcane rules because it's so small compared to the House of Representatives, that the House of Representatives had to come up with all kinds of pretty ironclad rules early on to make people behave. So the House of Representatives doesn't have the filibuster because early on they got big enough that they had to find a way to stop people from talking. The Senate was small enough that they never had to learn to stop people from talking. So that's all a filibuster is it's somebody can keep talking and never let anybody get any more business done. And now, because of a series of reforms that were put in place in the 1970s, you don't actually have to keep talking. You can just say you're going to talk. And a lot of people who are talking about reforming the filibuster are like, hey, at least go back to the talking part where you couldn't just say, I'm going to filibuster. Anyway, that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that Senate business takes a lot of time to get through. And when they put through nominations for things like the military or the State Department, many of the Senate approved nominations, they're uncontroversial. As in the case of these military appointments, they are literally somebody moving up a step. So it's somebody who's already been vetted. They've been in the field for a huge amount of time. The same thing is true in the State Department, where Rand Paul put a hold on for a while until there was a coup in Niger and we didn't have a confirmed ambassador there because of his hold. And then the next day he's like, oh, oopsie poopsie, we'll go ahead and let you have these ambassadors. So what happens is when they go to put those people through, those uncontroversial people, now they'll fight over controversial people, but there's lots of uncontroversial people and they just go through. They do them by a method called unanimous consent. And that says we don't have to go through all the stages of hearings and yeses and nos and votes and committees and all this. We'll just say yes to all of them. That's what Tuberville is putting his hold on. He's saying, no, we're not going to approve these by unanimous consent. And the reason that that's a problem, and people have said, why don't they just put them through one at a time? Because it is so slow and so cumbersome, they would not be able to get through for the rest of this Senate, even the number they've got already. They could do nothing else. So that's one reason they won't do it. Another reason they won't do it is that this looks terrible for the Republicans. Um, and that's, Schumer's no idiot. He recognizes how bad that looks and how angry people are getting, especially people in the military. I mean, can you imagine you're out there risking your life for this country and you've got some expletive senator who is saying you can't have a commanding officer? I mean, what is with that? So that's an issue. The other issue I think that it is worth having on the table here is that Tuberville claims that he is doing this over abortion policy. Maybe. Maybe he's doing it for attention. That's possible too. But I am always nervous at this point after going through Mitch McConnell's hold on Merrick Garland for the Supreme Court and then Trump's many, many, many holds. If you may not remember this, but remember how many acting people he had that he would not put forward for Senate confirmation, and that was so that he could have control over who those people were. I do not trust any MAGA Republican, and Tuberville is very close to Trump. If you remember, he's one of the senators that Trump called on January 6th a couple of times. I don't trust anybody on that front. So I think the fact he's holding open those military positions is a real problem, especially when you recognize the degree to which Trump blamed the military for not supporting him in his coup attempt, and the degree after that to which the MAGA Republicans, primarily people like at the time Fox News personality Tucker Carlson, attacked the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, as they attacked him in every possible way. And I think they're really making an attack on the military. And at the very least, we need to have that on the table. And every time someone says, this is why Tuberville is putting a hold on the military, my answer is always, this is why Tuberville says he's putting a hold on the military. And I want to reiterate right now, which people have found useful. It is not illegal to lie anywhere in the United States, with a few exceptions, except in a court of law. So if these people are saying things, and at this point, I get articles from people all the time. Oh my God, what's all this about? And at this point, I used to panic like everybody else does. Now I assume that anything that is coming from the right wing is a lie. I just assume it's a lie. And then I look and I find out why it's a lie, what actually happened. But you should assume that anything you hear, until you have checked it to make sure it is real, is a lie. Because I just don't, I think they've lost any right to have the MAGA Republicans to have anybody believe what they say. It's just factually not true, which makes my hair catch on fire, by the way, because I actually think we need to have two healthy political parties, which I'll talk about in a minute, but they must be fact-based. And so when people blatantly lie, some of you follow me on Twitter and know every once in a while I just can't stand it, and I go after Marsha, whatever her name is, or Kevin McCarthy, or Ted Cruz, just because it is deeply offensive to me when they're just blatantly lying. All right, so that was Tuberville. Somebody asked, why does the United States not belong to the International Criminal Court at The Hague? Which seems like we should, right? There's actually a pretty solid reason for why we don't. I always thought it was just because we had so many war criminals that we didn't want to, I didn't know. I never looked into it, and I always thought, it's because everyone's afraid they can't leave the country. There's actually a legal reason why why we have not joined the International Criminal Court, and it's a good one. And that is that our Constitution provides for our own legal system, and we really can't give up control over that to any outside body. And that's a position that's shared both on the left and the right. There is also, I think, a very good thing that kind of overlaps with what I was saying about how many Americans might get in trouble if we did belong, and that's that the United States, since World War II, has been uniquely involved in other countries, for good or bad. And they feel like an international criminal court makes the United States much more susceptible than other countries would be. So that's the answer to why that is. Whether or not you agree with that, I'm just telling you what the news is. All right, and one more question from here, I thought. And maybe this is part of, oh, here's a good, well, no, I'll put that one into something else. Somebody asked, why doesn't the media report the good news, only the bad news? And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. I don't know the answer to that because I'm not a member of the media. Um, First of all, I think that um, it, because I try and write the news every day and figure out what's important. And if you're trying to fill a column, it's easier to fill a column with things that are shocking. It's easier to write. There's new things about it. There's emotion. It's usually a very simple story. I also think, though, that at least since Watergate, there has been a tendency to distrust the government and to distrust good news, because if you're celebrating something, you're always opening yourself up to disappointment. No matter what I say, for example, that's good in the world, I always get mail saying, how dare you say X? Y happened? And here's the bad in this. Whereas if you lead with, this all sucks, you haven't exposed anything. Everybody can just say, yeah, it all sucks. And people who are hopeful or who are feel that good things are going on are kind of like, oh, okay, I guess I thought things were good, but I guess they're not. So I think there is a human reaction to not wanting to be the one to say, yeah, things are pretty good right now, because you're kind of putting your heart out there. And I'm actually not a fan of Teddy Roosevelt, really. I know him pretty well now. And I know that sounds weird for somebody who read about the Republicans, but where I came down with Theodore Roosevelt is that what he really did more than anybody else, for all the good he did and the bad he did, is that he dared to talk about principles, and he dared to say that he cared about them. Now, he was not the only one in the 19th century to do that, but he was one of the few Republicans in the 19th century to do that. Others did. William Jennings Bryan did, for example. He was a Democrat. Um, uh, Garfield did, but Garfield, of course, was assassinated in 1881. So Teddy Roosevelt got up there and he talked about principles in really simple language. And there's that quotation he has about being the man in the ring, and everybody's carping at the man in the ring. And I think there's a lot to that. And I think it's easier for journalists not to put their hearts out there and to say, hey, look, this is a good idea that, for example, one of the things that has really interested me is since last summer, really, it's been very, very clear, actually since February of 2022, but since last summer, it's been very clear that the Biden administration is investing an enormous amount of energy and of goodwill in relationships in the Indo-Pacific. And, coming out and saying, hey, this is a really big deal, and this is probably a really good thing. People are doing that, but most of them are State Department or Defense Department journalists. And by the way, state and defense journalists are very, very good. They're quite a bit different than you're normally going to see for the Capitol Hill reporters. But that's one of those places where saying, hey, good foreign policy, Americans are not accustomed to hearing good things about their foreign policy, at least since Nixon, really. So that's a place, I think, where it's easier to be cynical, for journalists to be cynical. And then finally, I would say, and maybe this is obvious, but writing thorough stories that really look into the good and bad of things takes a lot of time, and you have to be really well trained to do it. And that's very, very difficult to find in today's media landscape, where newsrooms are being cut and people don't have a lot of money, and you got to turn around stories in a hurry. I have the luxury, for example, I expect tonight to write about, I'm not sure, but I expect to write about the administration's new attempt today, not a new attempt, new policy today for student borrowing and student loans. Student loans are enormously complicated. And before I even start to write about student loans, I know from my training that there was a huge debate in the United States about what a proper debtor was. Well, now, if you're somebody just coming out of journalism school, how are you going to know that? I mean, and if you did know it, where are you going to look? So, even for me, who knows where the sources are, it's going to take many, many hours. If you're a 27-year-old, where do you even start? And so I think what they make the mistake often of doing is accepting rumors, or accepting so and so said, um, for more weight than it's worth. So, for example, today, one of the things that jumped out at me in the news today is, officials say that something, something, something about the Ukraine war. Do you know anything about how to array troops to fight a war between Ukraine and Russia? I sure don't. I mean, I actually know a little bit about troop movements and about strategy, but I would never sort of go with, anonymous people saying things, because it certainly seems to me, if you really know anything about what's going on, you're going to keep your mouth shut. So that's a case where I didn't even bother to read those stories, because I was like, I don't. Why should I? If I'm going to listen to sort of a mainstream report on that, I'm going to go to actual Defense Department briefings and actual Defense Department journalists. Which, by the way, at defense.gov or state.gov, you can listen to or read all of those briefings every single day. They have a daily briefing. All right. So now some more general things that I can give you some more information on. And these are large pictures, I think. So one of the things that somebody asked, I'm going to put it together with a number of other ideas, is somebody said that they saw an article yesterday about how the American Revolution was a war of necessity to unite the colonies to prevent an outbreak of civil war. And what does that say about the colonies, or what does that say in general? So I would say, first of all, the colonies were bitterly divided, and I'm going to take a pass on that. That's how they were, that they launched the American Revolution to keep them together. I could debate that at great length, although I do talk about it in my new book. There is another new book that argues that the Civil War was an attempt on the part of elite enslavers in the American South to stop there being a class war in the South. That's by Carrie Lee Merritt, and it's called Masterless Men. And it's a wonderful book. I think it's perhaps a bit overstated, but her contention that in fact the economic system had been so loaded in the American South that it was only helping a very few oligarchs, and thereby creating enormous class conflict, is absolutely on point. And I could make a long argument on that front if you cared about, but for our purposes today, I think it's a really, really important idea. The idea that if you are facing internal conflicts, that often you start a war elsewhere. And actually, here's something you may not know. When just before the U.S. Civil War broke out, in fact, Secretary of State William Henry Seward suggested to Lincoln that he could bring the North and South together by declaring war on Russia or England, or I think France was in that. He said it really didn't matter who Lincoln declared war on, so long as he declared war, because it would bring the North and the South back together. And to his credit, Lincoln just pocketed that baby. It is in his papers. If anybody's interested, you can find them online. I believe it's April 1st, 1865, although I haven't looked at it for a while. But the reason that I mentioned it, and the reason it's important, I think, is because of the place that the Republican Party finds itself now in the United States. And that is when I see Republicans calling now for attacking Mexico, which a number of them have done. That's huge. So why would they do that? And I'm gonna jump you now to someplace like Russia. I mean, Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 seemed pretty clearly to be an attempt to pull together his faltering numbers and the increasing unrest within Russia. And one of the things I said a few weeks ago was, whenever one country invades another, The first place to look is not at that other country. It's to look internally at the country doing the invading. What is wrong internally that it has suddenly decided to invade? And so right now, I'm watching the calls among Republicans to invade Mexico or to bomb Mexico with real interest. First of all, Mexico is our chief trading partner. It is an ally. We share a large border with it, and bombing another country is a cause for war. I mean, it would be a declaration of war. So the fact that they're even suggesting doing that is simply outrageous. And now I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole. Their argument is because that would take care of fentanyl production, illegal fentanyl production in Mexico. But in fact, what the Trump administration tried to do to stop the importation of illegal fentanyl, which is different than what is ascribed in what's the word, given as prescriptions in hospitals. Nurses have asked me to point that out when I talk about that, because people are afraid to take whatever's prescribed to them, and it's not the same thing. I'm not a doctor, but I've been asked to give that caveat. The Trump administration tried to hit the drug mules, which was not completely useless, but largely useless, because they could the people who were producing fentanyl, which is enormously profitable, could simply find others. So what the Biden administration has done is tried to put pressure on both the people funding what are essentially factories at this point, by putting sanctions on them and by stopping the flow of money to them so they can't afford to continue to make it, and stopping what are called the precursor chemicals, which are coming largely from places like China and other places. It's not just China, it's largely China, but other places, to stop them being able to make it in the first place. So they've also, of course, beefed up the borders and beefed up security and stopped tons of fentanyl coming in. It is a crisis, but the idea that the Biden administration is doing nothing, and the way to stop it is by grabbing people across the border, when in fact fentanyl is imported largely by American citizens, is kind of missing the point. All right, so I'm sorry, I was reading and I shouldn't have been, because it knocked me off track. Oh, so when they're talking about bombing Mexico, why? Like if it's not really about the fentanyl, and if it is basically declaring war on one of our chief trading partners, why would you do that? Well, you would do that if you recognize that you were losing power, that if you desperately wanted to drag people behind your standard. It's kind of a truism that in a time of war, people tend to grow together as a nation. They tend to join together as a nation, the same way that the Confederacy did behind the firing on Fort Sumter in April of 1865. So why would they do that? Well, they would do that if they recognized that they didn't have the kind of cohesion and the kind of power that they need in order to take over the country. So now I'm going to do another little bit of a rabbit hole here to try and hit a lot of your questions. Somebody asked, what sent the country to civil war? Well, this is one of the things that sent the country to civil war. Think about when it was happening. So people talk nowadays about a civil war, and I would love to have an opportunity to talk more about that. Maybe I will, because it's not a simple question, and there's a lot of different ways to look at it. But one of the key pieces about the American Civil War is that the route from Lincoln's election to the firing on Fort Sumter was enormously short. It was from, let's say, early December of 1860 to early April of 1865. So December, January, February, March, 3 months. I'm sorry, 4 months, I can't count, 4 months. And remember, that's the winter months. So it's the winter months in the American South, when people were hanging out at Christmas parties for the most part. They're not planting in the winter. They're the people who were instigating rebellion were egging each other on over Christmas punch, and then nothing happened. Lincoln is inaugurated in March of 65, and he's like, I'm not going to fight you guys. You just go do you. fully recognizing that the longer this spun out and once planting season started, the harder it would be to convince people to back a war against the United States. Um, so when in fact the United States government resupplies Fort Sumter in April of '65, the Confederate government felt it had to fire on Fort Sumter, because if it didn't, the the state militia of South Carolina would do it, and thereby prove that the Confederate government was useless, and the entire thing would fall apart. So then, once you got the firing on Fort Sumter, then you can start to say, "Oh yeah, we're fighting a war to keep us all together." But the key to all of that happening was that it happened really, really, really quickly. People didn't have time to sit there and think this through, and they didn't have time to say, "Oh no, that's not a good idea." And they were all sort of feeling their oats in the same way that, that's horses, by the way. Horses get extra excited when they've had oats. Um, uh, the same way that the insurrectionists were all excited in on January and before January 6th. Now we're 2.5 years down the road. Do you really think they're going to do that again, now that they've watched more than 1,000 of them get tried, and now that so many of them have gone to jail, and now that a lot of us are awake and going, "Oh my God, we don't want that to happen in our country"? So what sent the country to civil war in part was just speed. And so somebody asked, is there a contemporary equivalent? And the answer I would say is that sure, I could argue this in a lot of ways, but the two really strong pieces about the comparisons between the 1850s and the present that stand out for me are that the equivalent of January 6th, if you will, or of the recognition that the United States had been taken over by a small minority of wealthy people, that really happened in 1854. And by 1860, just 6 years later, Americans elect Abraham Lincoln. And remember, these are all white men. These are all white men who are voting. No women, no people of color, no Black Americans. They take a look at what's happening in the takeover of the government, and they're like, no, we're not doing that. And then they're willing to go fight for it. So I keep pointing to the fact that people are awake now, that they are, hey, my new book is called Democracy Awakening. That wasn't an accident, I promise you. So I look at that, and I also look at the fact that Trump's opportunity was January 6th, and the pieces were all there. If in fact he had been able to call out the troops for the Insurrection Act, under the Insurrection Act, I don't know where we'd be right now. But once that moment passed, and once people had time to breathe and to step back and to say, hey, wait a minute here, maybe we don't want to go to jail for Donald Trump. Maybe we don't want to be bankrupted. Maybe we don't want our country to be destroyed. That moment has changed. I'm not saying it's over. I'm still very concerned about the upcoming election because of the degree to which those MAGA Republicans have stacked the state parties and the election apparatus. But that moment of, we're going to rise up and take it, that moment has passed, and now it's turned into something very different, I think. Okay, so I wanted to get into this because I wanted to talk about the Republican Party and why they are where they are and what things look like. So one of the things that is people are asking about, for example, and I'm going to try and put these together, although I may not do it in any terrific order here because my notes, I just wrote down what you wrote, and so I'm doing this on the fly here. People have said, well, if Trump might be disqualified under the 14th Amendment legally, I mean, I think he is anyway, but if that actually happens, what about the Congress critters who participated? Because we know that some did, and none of them have been charged. This fascinates me. This fascinates me. Not because of any of the people that you're thinking about. As you know from the beginning, I have wondered at great length about Chuck Grassley's statement that Mike Pence wouldn't be there the next day. That's back in the news again. And why he thought that he was going to be the one counting the electoral votes. And because of this, and again, one of the things somebody asked me, like, how do you know how do you know who's involved and all that? And my answer is always, I don't tend to watch the actors. I tend to watch the people on the peripheries and to see how they're reacting. So people are like, is Trump, everyone asks me, is Trump going to jail? I don't know if Trump's going to jail. What I can tell you is that his behavior is so freaking erratic and so out there right now. I think he thinks he's going to jail. And similarly, um, so I don't know if he's going or not, but I think he thinks he's going to jail. And if you watch the people and their reactions, that's what I do. So one of the reactions that has always fascinated me is in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. First of all, Donald Trump gave the Medal of Freedom to Ohio Representative Jim Jordan, and he didn't say why. It was pretty quiet, but it happened. You can look it up. And then as news came out about phone calls that the former president had made or that had been associated with him, there were a number of calls from Jim Jordan. And he was like, sure, of course, I talk to the president all the time. This is not a big deal. Maybe or may not. That's fine. But he got incredibly squirrely about one set of phone calls. And that was the phone calls the morning of the insurrection. Now, I don't know what they might have discussed, but the difference in his behavior jumped out at me. Maybe I was wrong. Who knows? But it suggested to me those two things, as well as the obvious things, the calls to Tuberville, the fact that clearly some members of Congress did not appear to be frightened, Josh Hawley's fist pump and all that sort of thing, that there are members of Congress who are nervous right now. And they have not been charged with anything. What that is going to look like, I don't know, but honest to God, that's the piece I want to know more than anything else, because Donald Trump is his own thing, and that whole group of people he had around him are one thing. But these are people who are sitting now in our government. And that's the piece that I care very deeply about, that I don't know anything about. And I'm really interested in that. So what does that say? What does that say for a political party that you have a significant number of people, not only those particular people, but also members of the House Freedom Caucus, for example. And there are a lot of them, more than 100 people who belong to the House Freedom Caucus, which is an evangelical-based group that want to get rid of the New Deal government. Basically, they want to get rid of the government that we have and take it back to the period before the 1933. And increasingly now are also interested in adding to that Christian nationalism. And Jim Jordan was an organizer of the Freedom Caucus. So was Mick Mulvaney, who was had a number of positions in Donald Trump's White House, and Mark Meadows, who became Donald Trump's chief of staff and who exchanged texts, as you remember, with Ginny Thomas, who was Clarence Thomas's wife, about how, their Christianity and all that, they were going to keep Trump in office so that he could make their Christian vision come true. What do you do when you have a significant number of an American political party that has, at this point, embraced Christian nationalism? Well, here's a real problem. It was one thing when they were operating under where people didn't know. Did you know, for example, that Mark Meadows was an evangelical Christian who formed the Freedom Caucus? You do now. It was one thing when you didn't know who those people were, when Mick Mulvaney just seemed to be some guy who was messing around with the Office of Management and Budget. Once people recognize what's there, they know that we don't want that a majority of Americans, and by the way, this is not contested. This is not me sounding hopeful that a majority of Americans don't want Christian nationalism. A majority of Americans don't want Christian nationalism. We don't want the illiberal democracy that was embraced by Viktor Orban in Hungary and that essentially has turned him into an authoritarian in that country. The same kind of ideology that people like Chris Rufo, for example, in Florida, and some of the many other people who are embracing Christian nationalism are talking about in the United States. We don't want that. And once you have a political party that has been corrupted by that and has been taken over by that, what do you do? How do you go forward? So people have asked me about this I'm going to turn on some lights. I can't believe it's late enough in the season. We need lights now. Have asked me about the Republican nomination in 2024, and of course, the numbers right now suggest that Trump has that nomination for the simple reason that the Christian nationalist base of the Republican Party is going to vote for Trump. End of discussion. And they're the people who show up at primaries. Really bad news in the general, because the rest of us don't want any part of it. And even, by the way, non-MAGA Republicans don't really want Trump running either. So what about what's happening at the upcoming debate for the Republican primary? So somebody said, well, aren't they all kind of extremists? And the answer is yes. The Republican Party, and which is, of course, I wrote the book on the Republican Party, has lost its way entirely. It's gotten rid of everything. I mean, it's in an absolutely new place for it. It's a unique place for it, where it is not simply a party that's embracing oligarchy, as it has been at times in its past. It has gone full Christian nationalist. And so in order to get that base vote, every single person on that stage is going to have to say that they support getting rid of charges against Trump, and that they believe essentially in Christian nationalism. Now, they might wink and nod to do that, and similarly, people have asked about Glenn Youngkin from Virginia. He is one of them. He is just somebody who's going to hide it and pretend that that's not the case until he convinces enough moderates that they should get behind him. So it's a real problem for the Republican Party that anybody they nominate, by definition, is already at odds with the majority of the American people. So all they're going to be able to do is to tack right to get the nomination, and then quick as a bunny try and tack left so that the general Americans don't understand what they're up to. People asked about why Trump is not debating, and this seems quite obvious to me. First of all, he doesn't need to. He's going to get the nomination unless he's completely crashes and burns. Second of all, he doesn't look good these days, and television debates are made by how good you look, and he looks horrible, so he's not going to go out and show himself in public that way. And third, you actually have to prepare for debates. Even if you get very little time, you need to prepare for them, and there's just no freaking way that man has the mental power at this point to prepare a question, for example, on the Indo-Pacific. I mean, how many countries do you think he could name in the Indo-Pacific? He just came out and said he's going to slap a 10% tariff wall around America, which is like, it's not even a good policy in the 1890s. It's probably something he could remember. So he doesn't want too much publicity right now, because as long as he keeps his mouth shut, he's standing in pretty good shape. So somebody asked, if this is the case, two things. First of all, why can't these extreme members who are embracing Christian nationalism, and those members of the Freedom Caucus, for example, who have said they're going to shut down the government at the end of September, which is always unpopular, why can't they see what they're doing and see that it's wrong? And I think the answer to that is really interesting. And it's an answer, if you'll forgive me, it's summer, and I haven't been actually feeling great, so I've been spending a lot of time just kind of laying around reading. And it actually speaks to the concept of conservatism, real conservatism, Edmund Burke conservatism from the time of the French Revolution. And that's that Burke argued at the time, you don't need to know about the Burke stuff, but it's just interesting. I'll explain to you why I was reading it, but he said, you should never try and govern based on an ideology. And his complaint was the ideology of the French Revolution. He stood against that, because he said pretty soon you start trying to force people to fit that ideology, rather than governing in such a way that it actually serves the needs of the people and preserves stability. You're going to create havoc in a big way if you try and force people to fit a certain kind of ideology. And the reason I was reading Burke was because I'm fascinated right now by DeSantis in Florida, whose governance is bonkers. I mean, if you're trying to preserve your popularity, you could not go about it in a worse way. And I think that that's really the answer, that so many of the Republican Party now believe so fervently in their ideology that they can't believe it's not real. They can't believe it doesn't work. And any of those of us who disagree with it are somehow anti-American or somehow are evil. We're groomers. We're any number of the things that they have identified as being dangerous to the world, to them, to the world, to God, to whomever they are ascribing the ultimate power of their ideology. And so it just makes sense, if you know you're right, that anything that advances that cause should be right. That, of course, is the kind of absolutism that gives us authoritarianism, that gives us religious governance like the Taliban, that gives us any kind of the exact sort of governance that Edmund Burke warned against, an ideology that threatened to try and fit people into a world that doesn't exist. So I think they're willing to go ahead and do that because they just think they're right. They think that God is on their side and they're legislating according to the way the world should be. And those of us, the majority of us who don't want that, are just misguided. And that's not new to them, by the way. This ideology and that argument that the rest of us who want a New Deal government, for example, are misguided goes all the way back, really to the 1930s, but it was really articulated very, very well in 1951 by William F. Buckley Jr. in his book God and Man at Yale, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom, in which he says, you can't trust people to make good decisions based on reality. So we just got to go ahead and tell them what they need to do. So I think, first of all, that they just think they're right and that God is on their side. And if that's the case, you don't need to compromise, because by definition, you need to be an absolutist. Now, that being said, another thing that goes along with this is somebody asked, and I think you asked somewhat is sort of embarrassed, why does it seem like so many Republicans are guilty of stuff? And am I just reading that wrong and not seeing how many Democrats are guilty of stuff? And the answer to that is no, absolutely not. Right now, tons of Republicans are breaking the law right and left. Why would that be the case? Two reasons. One, because they think they're right. So many of these people who are voting illegally, voting twice and all that they keep complaining about, and it keeps turning out to be white Republican men who are voting twice or doing things that are illegal. Why do they feel that that's okay? Because they feel that the system, by letting, for example, people of color vote or women vote or Black Americans vote, has been corrupted, and they're working to take what they consider a pure system back. And if they have to break the law to do it, so be it. So that's one reason. And the other reason is one that speaks to why I'm so concerned about always making sure there are at least two healthy political parties. And that's that in places where there is not oversight by the opposition political party, corruption runs wild. And that's right now, it's biting the Republicans in a really big way, especially in the American South. But, until the 1960s, it was the Democrats in the South who had the exact same problem. That is, so long as you have sewn up the entire system with your own cronies, are you really gonna call out your Uncle Bob when he starts pocketing money from the Treasury? The answer to that is no. And we know that, and it's not about political affiliation, it's about human nature, which is why in a democracy, you need to have oversight. And the reason you're not seeing it on the Democratic side nearly as much right now is because the Republicans have jumped down the throat of every Democrat who puts so much as a toe out of line. And they've left office. They've gotten out of the public sphere because of the degree to which they've been doxxed, or the degree to which they have been sort of forced out of the public sphere. That being said, there was a representative from California, a woman who was basically doxxed out of Congress by having naked photos shared, and was forced out of Congress because she was a victim of that and had her own naked photos shown. And she actually put something on social media when Marjorie Taylor Greene put up naked pictures, apparently illegally obtained naked pictures of Hunter Biden, and saying, wait a minute, you threw me out of Congress because someone did this to me. Now you've actually got a Republican in Congress doing it, and it's acceptable? And the answer is no, it's not acceptable. But the Republicans are covering for each other and letting themselves get away with more and more. And of course, people are turning against it. Of course, they're angry. And of course, where the parties, in the opposite position, the other would probably be happening. But right now, the Democrats look really good because they are really good because they've been called out on everything in the American South when the positions were reversed. Did you ever think about why, in fact, there isn't the governor doesn't have pardoning power in Georgia? Doesn't have pardoning power in Georgia because the Democrats were so corrupt in the 1930s that the state, even though it was only white male Democrats voting, said, you guys have gone way too far. We got to take the pardoning power out of your hands. So that's why it looks like there's so many more corrupt Republicans right now, because there are. But that's a function of the system and the way the system works and the fact that they have not had sufficient oversight. Look at Ohio. Look at Florida. Oh my God. Look at Mississippi. Really, do you honestly think that Brett Favre and that whole thing in Mississippi would have been okay under Democrats in Mississippi? Not a chance. All right, so finally, people have asked once again what one does, and the answer once again is to take up oxygen and to reiterate that you care about democracy and that you care about the truth, and that things like the incessant repetition of things that are not true on social media, often pushed by accounts from Russia or from China or from Iran, are wrong, and that the real way you make a difference in politics in this country, as somebody who's not involved in politics, is by convincing your neighbors. And that doesn't mean knocking on their doors and saying you suck. It means calling out people who are spreading bad rumors or who are misrepresenting what's happening, the same way that you wouldn't let them do it about a neighbor, or that you wouldn't let them do it in your living room. I always say everybody is welcome to my parties so long as you don't pee on my rug. And people who are peeing on your rug ought to be called out for peeing on your rug. And in this case, peeing on your rug actually means, I'm sorry, but pissing on this country and what it could be. So going forward, once again, someone said, should you have hope? And I will reiterate with what I always say. I was terrified in 2000, well, from George W. Bush until 2016, because it was happening all around us and nobody seemed to care. And here we are, and you got more than 4,000 people listening to me just go on about this today on your nice afternoon. You got people out there knocking on doors. You got people writing into newspapers and saying, hey, what Ron DeSantis is doing isn't okay. Or, hey, in Ohio, we are not going to let them change the Constitution to take away our voice. Remember, at the end of the day, this country belongs to you and me. And so when you ask, what are they going to do to us? The answer should be, what are we going to do with our country? And we have, a little over a year to make it clear the direction that we would like this country to move in. Does not mean we're all going to agree. Does not mean the government's ever going to get everything 100% right, because by definition, people screw up. But it does mean we could put this country on a good direction, and a direction that it hasn't been on for 40 years, and that it could once again be on going forward. Reading right now a lot about Jimmy Carter, and I think, man, if we hadn't lost those 40 years, well, now's our time to take those 40 years back and see if we can do it right this time around. All right. Thank you for being here, and I will see you, I think, again next week. Talk to you later.